paying attention to is called On the Genealogy of Morality. It's a pretty seminal text by him in his later works. Now, in this book, Nietzsche famously calls into question any standard by which we can judge things as good and bad. And the reason he does this, the reason he thinks he can call into question any standard, is that in this book, he basically looks at all these standards by which we've judged things as good and bad in the past, and he shows that every construal of morality essentially has been by and for the sake of the ruling class's interests. So he thinks none of these standards are neutral. He thinks they're all politically charged. Now, you may automatically object and say, Nietzsche, so even if we grant that you've shown that all the moralities of the past have been politically charged and not neutral and not objective and a priori, you still haven't shown us that there isn't an objective morality that we can get to. Well, Nietzsche disagrees. The reason Nietzsche feels so confident in calling into question any standard by which we judge things as good and bad is because he thinks it is constitutive of our being, that ontologically, in the first instance, that we're always within a game of power. Now, this gets into Nietzsche's principle. It's a metaphysical principle called the will to power. So in his later writings, Nietzsche accounts for the metaphysical emergence and the existence of life by understanding life itself as will to power. And I quote, he says, "Materialism still needs to be completed. An inner will must be ascribed to it, which I designate as will to power, which is an insatiable desire to manifest power." So for Nietzsche, everything is fundamentally the will to power. It's the ontological position that everything is fundamentally a drive that aims to express power, and in light of this drive, every being is inextricably bound up with and can't be understood apart from other beings, because every being is essentially trying to express its power over others and differentiate itself by way of that. Now, that's the will to power, and we're going to see why we need to talk about that in order to understand ressentiment. But another thing, so Nietzsche uses the will to power to call into question any standard by which we can judge things as good and bad, but it seems like Nietzsche himself uses that ontological position to make normative claims. And this gets into his distinction between noble and slave morality. So, in other words, he conceives of morality, of the will to power in two ways. To use an analogy, kind of in the same way you just always already are the Cartesian eye representing the states you undergo. Everything is the will to power. So when a group dominates another, that's the will to power. When you digest food, you express your will to power over the food, I guess. So he thinks that some actions but he also conceives of the will to power in another way, kind of in the same way how, while you might always be the Cartesian eye representing the states you undergo, you might not always be in possession, as it were, of your Cartesian eye, where that means, you're not wholly responsible of the states you undergo and navigate. So in that sense, Nietzsche thinks that there are some actions that inhibit the will to power and some actions that promote the will to power. And that's noble and slave morality. So, quite frankly, noble morality are value systems that, don't depend on negating other things to understand what those value systems understand as good. Whereas slave moralities, they parasitically depend on the negation of something else in order to understand what it wants to understand as good. So an example would be, if I valued myself as good on the basis that I am not someone else, that's a slave morality. Now, this is all to get into view Nietzsche's understanding of ressentiment. Essentially, slave morality, Nietzsche thinks, is always a revaluation of some other value system, and that this revaluation has been motivated by feelings of ressentiment. So what is ressentiment? Well, it's a feeling that motivates behavior, Nietzsche thinks. And the feeling is triggered by feelings of suffering. As he says, ressentiment rules when there is a self-contradiction as a result of an obstructed and unfulfilled instinct and power will that wants to be mastered. In other words, ressentiment is triggered when the will to power is suppressed. So, one might want to will power over something, whatever it may be, And they might be in an environment in which that will to power they've been forced to suppress the will to power. And Nietzsche thinks that quite literally causes pain and suffering in the ressentiment subject. Nietzsche doesn't really get clear on exactly how he conceives of the pain, but I think it's the way he talks about it is almost just like frustration. I don't know if anyone here likes to read Shakespeare, but Shakespeare tends to he likes to justify like why like fights go on just because it's like a really hot summer day and that causes like frustration. I think that's the kind of pain that ressentiment causes, just this like angsty frustration. Now, to move on, this suppressed will to power, the pain that it causes, serves as the engine powering what Nietzsche calls the man of ressentiment's creative revenge. We'll see what that is in a second. But essentially, he wants to blame someone. A ressentiment subject wants to blame someone, whether it be themselves or someone else, for their pain. And they want to engage in a project of creative revenge on them. So revenge is essentially because, they feel suffering, and he wants, the ressentiment subject wants to avenge their suffering. The more interesting part is the creative reevaluation of values that goes on with ressentiment. So Nietzsche thinks that as the subject's will to power has been suppressed, and that suppression tends to be because of a reevaluation, because of a certain value system, right? In a value system in which strength is understood as good, someone who's weak can't express their will to power in some ways. So that subject would try to revalue things so as to understand weakness as good, so that they can express their will to power, that kind of thing. Bernard Regnister, who is a professor at Brown, honestly, he famously explains the radical nature of a resentful revaluation of values by contrasting it with the case of Aesop's fable of the fox and the grapes. Essentially, it's a story in which there's this fox, it sees these grapes that it really wants, but it realizes that these grapes are really high up and he can't really get them. So the fox essentially just says, oh, they were sour anyways, and he walks off. That's not a revaluation of values, right? The fox came into the situation, he wanted the grapes because they were sweet. But because he couldn't get them, he just says, oh, they were sweet, they were sour anyways, and he goes off. Regnister explains that for the fox to have engaged in a resentful revaluation of values, the fox would have had to deny the value of sweetness itself. And this kind of gets into the nature of why resentment always creates slave morality, right? For the fox, for example, the fox would have to deny the value of sweetness, which it already knows is desirable. It would have to negate and focus on the negation of sweetness in order to come to a position in which it can say, sourness is good, that kind of thing. So that's ressentiment. It's the stages of, it's essentially a project of expressing one's will to power. And this expression always creates slave morality, essentially. Now that we've gotten that under our belts, we can move back and look at Fanon. So I want to say that Fanon conceives of colonial racism itself as a Nietzschean slave morality. And this is pretty clear, right? Colonial racism negates Black people, and it's only on the basis of white people considering themselves not to be Black that they can come to see themselves as, inherently good, that kind of thing. Now, in order to make that claim, we've already seen that slave morality is always a revaluation of some other value system, and that value system is, always motivated by feelings of ressentiment. As such, we're going to have to identify those two things. And this is exactly what Fanon does in Blacks and White Masks. He first identifies an original value system from which the colonizer was responsible for creating, racism, obviously, develops the slave morality, i.e. racism, right? What Fanon explains is that, so essentially, Fanon was like a psychologist and he had all these patients. And so he performed kind of word association tests on his patients, on white people, on racist white people. And he found that they associated the word Black person, essentially, with sexual terminology. And from this, Fanon speculates that the original value system from which, racism is a revaluation of, is that of sexual superiority. In other words, Fanon thinks that the colonizer has eroticized the colonized. He thinks that white men have essentially actively gone out of their way to understand black men as sexually superior to them so as to feel ressentiment. So this is the essential, so this is the value system. Sexual superiority, that's the original value system. And this satisfies the exact conditions that trigger ressentiment, right? So white people, they want to be sexually superior, they have this will to power, and this perception they have of black people inhibits that will to power, creating ressentiment, right? Sorry. And this essentially would be responsible for creating racism, right? Essentially, the idea would be that value system suppressed will to power, and therefore the colonizer would have to go through a project of creative revenge. And he thinks racism is the product of that, slave morality, racism. That's essentially it. Now, we can finally come to a conclusion from this. So, Fanon conceives the source of what we can come to realize is that Fanon conceives of the source of the colonizer's restrictive behavior to be ressentiment from their perception of black people, right? So again, you perceive someone in a certain way, and that creates the ressentiment. And the ressentiment itself is what's restricting the colonizer to act in ways that are racist. Fanon generally thinks that the colonizer can't do anything but be racist because of their perception of black people as sexually superior. Right? The colonizer is restricted to interpreting their possibilities as limited to engaging in a project of creative revenge targeted at the source of their ressentiment, which is black people. And in other words, the colonizer's ressentiment is restricted to them being racist towards black people. And that's kind of it. Just a final thought. Fanon's solution to the problem of racism is essentially that he argues that both the colonizer and the colonized need to stop identifying each other by their colonial identities. But now that we've seen what the source of the colonizer's ressentiment is, it seems it's much more plausible that when Fanon says this, he's not saying that the colonizer needs to stop identifying black people as being inherently inferior. He's actually talking about the colonizer receiving black people to be sexually superior, because that's the actual source of their resentment. And that's what's restricting them to be racist, essentially. And that's it. That's the presentation. Thank you for listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. So we have some time for questions now. If you'd like to ask a question, just type Q in the chat so we can get a speaker's queue going, and I'll call on you. Or just jump in if you're the first to go.
Hey, I have a question. So I was wondering if, I was wondering a few things. First of all, what are we using as a definition for racism? As we all know, the term racism has actually undergone a little bit of a change in its definition over the past few years. Do you mind enlightening on that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I'm just focusing on what Fanon's dealing with. And he's essentially talking about the relationship between the French colonizers and the colonized in Martinique in the 1950s. So that's the scope of Fanon's project. Whether we want to expand that to other ways of talking about racism in modern day, we can consider that. But I'd say Fanon's is kind of focused on that in particular. And I mean, what the definition of racism itself is, I think it's just the very simple general one, right? That in which white people are understood to be inherently superior and black people are understood to be inherently inferior. And I wanted to show that that's a Nietzschean slave morality.
Interesting. So the concept